It's an honor to be here, and actually to begin, before we go into the material, I've been speaking on a regular basis in Australia, and it's common to open meetings with an appreciation for the original owners of the land. So I have included in my opening slide, and I apologize for mispronunciation, but an appreciation for the land where HEC Montreal stands, which was originally the land of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians and the Kahnawake and the Kahnawake Mohawk territories. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. At this conference, it is, of course, full of somewhat dystopian and maybe some utopian views on the impact of work and technology together. In fact, too much of the discourse is at the extremes. And what I'm hoping to do here is to introduce a new part of the landscape that is meant to be, let's say, realistically aspirational and positive. Most of the discourse is on jobs that will be disrupted, either replaced or enhanced by technology, occasionally jobs that are safe from technology. In today's remarks, I'm going to introduce a fourth or additional category, which is digitally enabled, what I'm going to call self-sufficient production. Now, when we talk about technology, it's important to say that there's a band of uncertainty around the entire conversation. This is a picture of the 1950s, from the 1950s on The Babysitter of the Future, and of course we know how it really turned out. So with that caveat, what I'd like to do is suggest that I'm going to focus on digital fabrication, which is interdependent with other accelerating technologies, whether it's AI, blockchain, biomedicine, or robotics, and you'll hear some connections to each. The important thing is that all of these technologies are moving at exponential rates of change, and that's going to be the subtext of the presentation. As background, the first two digital revolutions were digital communication and digital computation. And in each case, the shift was not simple, and it had organizational elements. The book, which I'll talk about briefly, which I co-authored with my two brothers, a whole journey that is itself of interest to us, at least. My middle brother, Neil, was early in his career at Bell Labs and met some of the people that were still around when the shift happened from analog to digital telecommunications. And they explained that the shift didn't happen because digital communications was a superior technology. It happened because the advocates for analog either died or retired. And in some ways, this is the challenge with science more generally, but what I'm going to be covering is what is in essence a third digital revolution. In addition to digital communication and digital computation, it's digital fabrication. And to appreciate that, this is a picture of a fab lab. And what's important about it is less the lab itself and more the fact that it's not just a 3D printer, it's not just any one additive or subtractive technology, but it's an entire bundle of technologies that together helps you design and make whatever you can imagine. And it's something that is generally located in a school or a community center or a library or a museum. I put in the corner here the map, just some of the fab labs that are near us. It started in 2001. The very first fab lab was in the south end of Boston. My son and I volunteered in that lab pretty much every weekend for 3 years. And a year later, there was 2 labs in the world, and then 4, and then 8. And the number of fab labs has been doubling every 18 months. We're going to come back to that doubling in a few minutes. But today there's over 1,000 worldwide. And to understand them, we really have to go back in time to Moore's Law. How many people here have heard of Moore's Law? So about a quarter, maybe, of the people in the room. In 1965, Gordon Moore wrote a delightfully titled article called Cramming More Components onto Integrated Circuits. The chart that you see on the right is the number of components that you could fit on an integrated circuit with 4 data observations. And if that was your only way of looking at the data, it wouldn't look like much was happening. But he converted the data onto a log-log chart where you can see exponential rates of change, doublings, and lo and behold, they formed a straight line. And with a straight line, you can make predictions, and so he predicted within 10 years that the ability to put more circuits onto a circuit, more components onto a circuit board would increase our capability. He said it would allow us to have something on our wrist that could communicate with others and do computation, that we would have the potential for self-driving cars. What he had to say in 1965 was fairly remarkable and almost generally ignored. The chart below is not 10 years, which is what he predicted, but 50 years of doublings of capability of computation, and you'll see that it's a virtual straight line. It's become, he didn't call it this, but others have now called it Moore's Law. I talked to a good friend who's in the strategy group at Intel, and I said, what's it like for 50 years living in an environment where the technology is doubling, and in fact at Intel you've had to drive that with this increasing capability. He said, you know the scene in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark where the boulder is coming and the guy's running to get ahead of the boulder? He said, that's been our life for about 40 years. That Moore's Law is not a law of nature, it's an expectation of the marketplace, and we've been racing every year to meet that expectation. The reason I'm telling the story today is the book that we wrote involved a plotting of the number of fab labs in the world, and lo and behold, we have 10 years of data, and guess what it looks like? It's a straight line with a doubling, and so what motivates this story is if the capability to produce things digitally continues to grow, we are sort of at the equivalent with digital fabrication of around 1980, 85 with digital communication and computation. We are in early in what could be an explosive story, and my job here is to tell you a little bit about that and show how it connects to work. So on the left, you see the progress from a single computer in the entire planet to large mainframes to what were small personal computers, initially as hobbyist tools and eventually as user tools, to universal computation, to ubiquitous computation, and it runs by about 3 orders of magnitude, 1 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 to there are now 1 trillion internet-related computing devices on the planet. Interestingly, in the late 50s, there was a single machine-controlled tool, CNC tool, a fab lab, and that also cost about $1 million. A fab lab, just like a large mainframe, costs around $100,000 and has a whole set of capabilities that fill a room, much like a mainframe computer. We're on the verge of the shift. People are using fab labs to make their machines that make machines, and personal computing capabilities is increasingly showing up still as a hobbyist tool, but it's increasingly going to be the case that in a neighborhood or a home, you'll have the ability to make what you need. And more importantly, as we look at the science going forward, and I'll say more about this at the end, there's the potential for digital and programmable assembly at the atomic level where you can, in effect, program materials in ways that are pretty extraordinary. So it looks to be on a similar curve, and I want to suggest in this context that it involves a different way of thinking. I have the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for job growth from 2016 to 2026, And they say there'll be 8% growth in hospitality workers, and that has a logic that probably makes sense. On the other hand, they're doing a straight linear projection for truck and tractor-trailer drivers from 1.8 million to 1.9 million over the next 10 years. And it is possible that that's what it will be. And it's also possible, as various self-driving technologies take hold, first with trucks being able to go in caravans, and eventually with other forms of self-driving, that the employment picture will change radically for the people who do that kind of work. Now, in an attempt to make sense of this, Katz and Kruger have written a paper in which they've tried to estimate, well, who's doing this platform-based, digitally enabled work of various kinds. And on the one hand, they have the number of total people working on part-time temporary work increasing from 2005 to 2015 by about 47%. So that's more than just a simple linear growth rate. More importantly, people were surprised when they actually said how many people are doing Uber driving, TaskRabbit, you know, the kind of classic digital work that a lot of people here have been talking about as being precarious and at-risk work. They said it's less, or right around half of 1% of the US workforce, around 750,000 people. Most people saw that number and said, boy, that's less than we thought. But in fact, if you go in a 10-year period from 0 to 0.5%, that's a very dramatic rate of growth. And if that continues, that's what I think is getting people's attention. So in our thinking, we've looked at the world of digital fabrication and mapped that onto the US Consumer Price Index category of basket of goods in a typical household. And lo and behold, you can find people in these fab labs, mostly one-off kinds of production, making things that fit into all the categories for the basket of goods. And by the way, here's some pictures of some of the stuff that fit into those baskets. And the thought question that I'm going to pose, and in a sense it's a Marxist question, can people own the means of production at a community or neighborhood level in a way that allows for local production that breaks the dependence on global supply chains, even if it's still interdependent with the sharing and reuse of designs, of material properties, and other kinds of things. So locally self-sufficient, but globally connected. That's the new category of work that I'm putting on the table. One way of understanding this, there's a fellow in Detroit, Blair Evans, who was a successful businessman. He then launched a charter school, and then since has bought about 20 acres of what was a food desert, a economically depressed part of Detroit. And he's introduced a model which he calls 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. He says a third of the time you should be working for someone to earn a salary to buy the things that you need to buy. A third of the time you should have access to a big central fab lab, which he's constructed, satellite labs in all the neighborhoods to make what you need, and a third of the time you should be following your passions. There's a lot of talk about the need for a base wage or some kind of base income, which never talks about the meaning of work and the dignity that comes from making and doing things. In a sense, his model says part of your existence that's self-sufficient involves that dignity of making what you need. And so there's the beginning of a thought around what self-sufficient production would be, and people are making hydroponics and other things, housing and furniture, to address what's not available in their neighborhood. It's also the case that fab labs have emerged in some of the remote parts of the planet. This is from the fab lab at the Cook Inlet Council in Alaska. And we have a hypothesis that the ability of people to engage in self-sufficient production may go fastest in the most remote regions of the world, in a sense a digital leapfrog, because there are fewer institutional barriers, fewer constraints, and the need is greatest. Supply chains for spare parts for your snowmobile just don't arrive. Now, having said that, let's talk about the institution of digital fabrication. The global network of fab labs has a charter. I said to my brother, who's sort of the founder of this whole movement, you need a charter, so he wrote one. And that's what you see here. But what the charter doesn't deal with are the things that many of us worry about. who makes decisions, how do you ensure fair treatment, how do you ensure health and safety, and so on. It's not a workplace governed by workplace regulation. It's a community center, and yet productive activity is taking place, so it doesn't fit into the institutional structure. And we know that institutions need to do two things at the highest level. They need to create value and mitigate harm. In this digital ecosystem, the Fab Labs and many other arrangements are almost 99% focused on creating value. There are ODR, online dispute resolution, and other innovations almost entirely focused on mitigating harm, but they rarely meet. And an ecosystem, to become a new institutional arrangement, has to do both. And so the ability to fashion institutional arrangements in a digital world needs to take that into account. And the way that I'm going to motivate the thinking on this is to understand the science and logic of digital. If you think about the institutions that we have across our society, most of the arrangements that we depend on were formed in response to the Industrial Revolution, typically almost a century afterwards. It was really in the late 1800s that professional societies, various legal regimes, and other things took their modern form. And they all have a hierarchical structure that matches the structure of centrally organized technology. I'm going to suggest to you that just as our current institutions co-evolved with the production technologies of society over more than a century, that we have these emerging digital technologies, and institutions and organizations will co-evolve with the science and logic of digital. What is digital? Digital involves bits, bytes, and packets that are modular, that can be assembled and reassembled with a property called error correction. It's how, when you reassemble things, you don't lose information. And I'd like to suggest to you that we already have some social arrangements that are more modular. Things like teams, work groups, projects. We also have digital platforms that are pushing those further, breaking work down into tasks and into component parts. That's the logic of digital. It's going to take us there. And the challenge is, we have some forms of error correction that are social, like checks and balances, like forms of near-miss reporting, and other kinds of activity in social systems. But in a sense, if the logic of the technology is moving us in a modular way, we need to develop more modular, adaptable institutional arrangements that provide the error correction kinds of social needs that go with where this technology is headed. So just to conclude, we did a global survey of leaders in the digital fabrication movement to understand their interest in what was at stake. I won't go into all of the survey results here, but one of the questions we asked is, what's a metaphor that you would use to describe what you do and how you do it, and what you observe about the future of digital fabrication? And we just not randomly, we picked a set of quotes that we most liked, and it was only afterwards that we looked at what countries they came from. And in fact, they came from all around the planet. I did include a map behind us that's turned on its head, just because that's what this technology is doing to us. But essentially, what I want to leave with is the notion that there is a distributed global network of folks who are pushing the frontiers of self-sufficient production, and they're doing so with a passion and enthusiasm that is breathtaking, making things that we can't even imagine, one-of-a-kind things, and most of them are not intent on becoming mass production industries. Most of them are intent on making what they need. And at a community level, that capacity represents something very powerful. What they don't have, largely, are the social scientists, the ethicists, the legal scholars, the industrial relations scholars, the organizational behavior scholars, who can lean in early to shape this technology so that it is a successful new social arrangement. Had we been as deeply involved in the first two digital revolutions in the early 1970s and early 1980s, we might not have had digitally weaponized media and all of the ill effects that we're now worried about with digital communication and computation. And my message to you is, we have a chance this time around. Let's lean in and do it. Thank you very much.